Hello, I'm Mark, and this is the Fast Track Impact podcast for researchers who want to be more productive and achieve real-world impacts from their research. This week I want to revisit stakeholder analysis. So this is, for me, a foundational tool that we all have to use if we want our pathway to impact to work and if we want it to be time efficient. That's why I build this into all of my trainings. If you've been to a training of mine, you'll have tried this out for yourself and you'll have discovered from experience that the way in which this helps you structure your thinking enables you to be way more effective. And the reason for this is that a stakeholder analysis enables you to take a step of empathy. Now, systematically, I am putting myself in the shoes of the people who might use or benefit from my research. And I'm understanding what they are interested in. I'm understanding the level of capacity they might have to influence my ability to achieve impact, either by blocking that or facilitating that. And I have a sense of the direct impact that this might have on them, for good or for ill. And as a result now, I am able to reach out in a very tailored, specific way to people that is ethically grounded in terms of what might go wrong. I've thought about that ahead of time, but is also incredibly efficient. So I'm not now just reaching out and saying, here's me, here's my research, be interested. I'm reaching out to each different group in a subtly different way, and I'm not misrepresenting myself. This is me. These are my interests. This is what we do as a group. But based on this analysis, I can see that you've got this particular challenge, and we think that our research might be able to help resolve part of that challenge. Or based on this analysis, we can see that you're trying to achieve a particular goal, a strategic objective, and we think that our research might help you. And so it is that intersection between my interest and theirs, that one thing that people are likely to say, yeah, hey, that's interesting, that I now reach out with. And so I may only send 2 or 3 emails based on the 2 or 3 that I think are most relevant for whichever reasons I choose. But I get responses from all 2 or 3 of those individuals representing those organizations. And they're like, yeah, let's meet up, let's talk. Because, yeah, if you can help us with that challenge, then of course, I want to talk. Great, tell me more. And now you begin on a pathway to impact. And importantly, that's a pathway to impact which you're able now to co-produce with that organization. So these are our challenges. This is what we're doing in this space at the moment. This is now how you might be able to help. And that's the kind of evidence that we need. And that's the point at which you can help. And now let's work together on this. And if there is the opportunity for them to co-fund or to help resource this, then you've now got people working with you on your pathway. So hugely important tool. And what I'm going to do in this episode is to take this to a new level. So my colleagues and I have been working on what we're calling a 3 I's framework, which enables us to think about this in 3 different ways. So this is now interest, influence, and impact. And we're asking each of these as a question, and we're asking each question in 2 ways. I'm looking for both a positive and a negative form. And then we're going to a level of depth in each of these categories that goes way deeper than you would ever expect to do. And because of that depth, we're now able to understand our stakeholders and the nature of their stake and what is driving those interests, or why they might try and block us, or what it is that will benefit them and how. And we get a much deeper understanding of that. And for me, that knowledge is then power to be able to affect more positive change, to think more deeply about the ethics of what I do, and to make sure that this actually does work rather than leading to negative unintended consequences. So this is being done in a collection of research projects with a bunch of colleagues. This is going to be a paper that will be led by Helen Kendall, one of the postdocs I'm working with on one of these projects. I trialled it first of all, we trialled our 3rd criterion, the impact criterion, in a project around obesity and health. And we're now trialling this into other environmental governance projects where we're not just adding that 3rd criterion, we're adding that 2nd layer of depth to all 3 of these. And I did the first of those stakeholder analyses with my colleague Regina Hansda last week. And the great thing is it's working. So there will be a peer-reviewed paper at some point. But the beauty of a podcast is I get to tell you this work in progress and tell you what works at present. So of course this may change by the time we get to the peer-reviewed paper, and you can take it with a pinch of salt. But I'm giving you this on the basis of having tried this out and seeing just how deep you can go with this, which is quite exciting. Linked to this, I have written a new guide, so I'll put a link to this in the show notes if you want to try this out for yourself, with a link through to the new template, a bunch of other information, and a workshop plan. And I'll finish this episode by going through that workshop plan. If you decide that you want to try this out for yourself, then join me on that cutting edge of stakeholder analysis, and together with Helen, Regina, and I, and the rest of our colleagues, you then would be welcome to pitch what you've done as an additional case study and potentially join the paper that we're writing on this. So. That's what we're doing. That's where we're headed, and let's dive into the 3 I's. So 3 questions asked in each case in both a positive and a negative form. First of all, interest. So the question is, who is interested in your research? And once I've identified who those people are, I want to understand the nature of their interest. So in contrast to the traditional interest-influence matrices that emerged originally in the business management literature in the 1980s, where you have a 2x2 matrix and we're just placing them in that 2x2 space in one of 4 boxes. 4 quadrants, which is quite a quantitative approach to this. What I care more about is actually the qualitative data I can collect about the nature of that interest, rather than whether it's necessarily high, medium, or low. Although I find those categories useful to help get the juices going in a discussion. So, who's interested and what's the nature of their interest, or who is currently disinterested? But these are people that you would like to be interested based on their influence or impact. So quite often at the end of an analysis, I'm going through and I've identified organizations that are stakeholders because they are hugely influential. They may be a gatekeeper, for example, and they may or may not have a huge amount of impact. They may in fact be a hard to reach group. So they have no influence, no interest, but they would be massively impacted positively or negatively, in which case I need to understand why is it that they are not interested, what is driving their disinterest, so that I can try and bring this to them and make this accessible to that hard to reach group. So who's interested and who is disinterested and why is my first question. The second question then is influence. Who has the power to facilitate or to block the generation of impacts from my research? And at this point, we're thinking indirect. So this could be a gatekeeper organization. This could be the organization that will give me access to the people, to the data, to the research permit, or whatever it is. It may be that they have some other form of power, so they are very rich and powerful, and in that sense, they might sue me to block me from doing my research. They might spread misinformation and conspiracy theories. Listen to last week's episode if you want to find out how to deal more effectively with conspiracy theorists. Or they may have the ability to powerfully facilitate my pathway to impact. Actually, they're massively interested in this, and they've got the resources and the manpower to be able to make this stuff happen. So my impact is their impact. Their impact is my impact. Now together we can achieve way more than we would ever have otherwise been able to achieve. But typically it is others who then benefit from it, their clients, their stakeholders, their customers, their patients, etc. The third of the 3 questions is around impact. So who is likely to benefit most from engaging with your research? So remember, the way that I define impact is all around this concept of benefit. But for me, that normative positive has to now trigger us to think about a negative as well. So whose interests might be compromised or harmed as a result of your work. So interest, influence, impact. Who's interested or disinterested? Who has the power or influence to facilitate or block the generation of impacts indirectly from my research? And who might then directly benefit most from engaging with that work, or directly have their interests compromised or harmed as a result of that engagement? Now, at this point, we're still on the surface of things, and I think that at this point already, this is hugely powerful. And this is as far as I'm going with my entry-level tool that you'll see on my website. But if you want to go deeper, then I think that there is a deeper level within each of these three categories. And I want to start asking some of those deeper questions that can uncover deeper, often hidden dynamics that might be driving what you're seeing on the surface of the analysis. If you want to have a look at the accompanying blog, you'll see a 2x2 matrix here, where you can see each of the three categories here, or questions, interest, influence, impact, and then an upper and a lower level to each of them. So the first two are quite straightforward. So interest at the top level, where we typically go, considers the stated interests and preferences of those who are interested or disinterested in your research. But then what I try to do is to go deeper, to articulate what are often implicit, underlying values, beliefs, and norms that might be underpinning or driving those higher level interests that I've identified quite quickly and easily. Or they might be driving the disinterest in this. So the fact that I identify with a set of political values, I'm right or I'm left, for example, might be what is driving the fact that I'm interested in some research that might empower the poor, or might enable us to create more jobs and improve the local economy, for example. At a very simple level. But actually now understanding why it is that actually people from that organisation tend to be left or right-leaning in their politics, or people in this particular public group or interest group tend to be one or other side. Now I can begin to think, so what is going on behind that? Why are they leaning in that direction? What are the drivers of that? And now I'm going in much better armed to be able to deal with a whole set of issues that they might raise around their engagement with this research, or that might raise for me in terms of where this takes me, which may or may not be comfortable in terms of my own personal politics, perhaps, for example. Second, let's go to this deeper level of influence. So typically when I ask people to tell me about the power that an organisation might have to facilitate or to block my ability to achieve impact, what I get are explicit forms of typically hierarchical power over forms of influence. So they're rich, they're powerful, they've got fancy lawyers behind them. They are the organisation that controls all of the resource, that is the gatekeeper, for example. They have more members than any other organisation of their type in the world, or whatever it is. That kind of power by numbers, by wealth, by hierarchy. It's the minister, it's the governing party, or whatever it is. Yeah. So typically this kind of influence is characterized by control, instrumentalism, self-interest, but we can go much further than that. You get the idea. What I want to do is to then probe a little bit deeper and to understand this other implicit, personal or transpersonal, what I would describe as power with forms of influence, which are more likely to be forms of empowerment. So we're contrasting power over and power with here. And these power with forms of more implicit personal, transpersonal power or empowerment are typically characterized by dialogue, inclusion, negotiation, and sharing of power. And so, and in some cases, you get organizations that have both. So it may be that I've got someone who is very rich and powerful, and as a result is able to employ fancy lawyers. And at the same time, they are also very well politically connected, and it is that personal power that enables them very often to pull strings without ever having to resort to that hierarchical. So that's that power over type influence. Or looking at it a completely different way. Very often I work with people who have natural leadership abilities, and you see them before they've ever reached their full potential at the bottom of the traditional hierarchy. And the example I always give is my good friend and colleague Anna Aptley. From Project Maya, if you want to look her up. And when I first met her, she was at the bottom of the hierarchy, PhD student, but bucket loads of personal, transpersonal power, way more powerful in terms of actually drawing people to her, influencing people, getting people to naturally want to follow her, than the director of that institute at the time, which happened to be me, who nobody respected whatsoever and would just, in fact, out of principle, do the opposite of. And so who are those kinds of people? And it may be that whilst I'm looking at this organization, I'm fine-graining my analysis and realizing that, well, that's the boss, but actually that person over there who you might not expect, they're the person with all the power. And when I'm doing this as a workshop, as I'll describe it at the end of the podcast episode, very often it's that kind of intelligence that I'll get from the stakeholders I bring into the room that is invaluable. So you know what? If I want to make this work, I don't go straight to the top. I go to that person first, and I get them on side, and I get them to help me understand the context within that organization. And then together we pitch this to the boss. And that's how we make something happen, for example. And then finally, I've got my third criterion, impact. And this is considering those who are likely to directly benefit most or directly be negatively impacted from engaging with the research. And the key reason why I've added this third criterion to a method that has remained unchanged pretty much since the 1980s, if you look at stakeholder analysis and how it is typically practiced in the literature, is because when you're only looking at interest and influence, you are potentially going to further marginalize the marginalized, to further cut out the voiceless, and to completely forget the fact that there are some very important but hard to reach groups that you want to bring into your research and you want to try and enable to achieve benefit from that work. And so this is the kind of the classic situation where a traditional interest influence matrix would say, well, they've got no interest in this, totally disinterested, no power whatsoever, and they're now categorized as the crowd, typically. And they're the group that you're going to reach last and potentially cut out altogether because you haven't got time to reach everyone in the crowd. But actually now where I identify that this disinterested, low power group could potentially be the one group who would benefit most if we could empower them and or make them interested enough to engage and to get those benefits, then yeah, actually, morally speaking, this is a really important group that is systematically getting cut out of stakeholder analysis. So using the concept of benefit to define impact, the impact criterion asks why and how stakeholders might benefit or be negatively impacted by engagement with the project or its research. And like the other two criteria, it can operate on these two levels. So at the top level, let's think about it simply. I'm just using this to identify immediate impacts from engagement, whether these are benefits, such as the formation of new networks, capacity, knowledge, or skills, things that can happen quite quickly, quite close to your research. or whether these are negative impacts, such as causing offence, misunderstanding, disengagement, for example. Again, quite immediate negative impacts that can occur from your engagement. But secondly, let's just go a bit deeper than this and ask ourselves now how we might be able to use this impact criterion to consider the longer term, perhaps more putative benefits or negative impacts that might arise from the achievement of those initial benefits. And what I'm encouraging you to do here is to think deeper about what potentially might happen longer term. Yeah, we're going to get these short-term benefits, but let's just have a think about some of the assumptions I'm making, some of the risks that I might not have fully thought through here, and some of the quite cool things that might happen if I were to think about this a little bit more explicitly right at the outset and bring this into the conversation. And then let's see where this goes. So this may include more instrumental benefits such as new policies or economic, social, environmental, health or cultural benefits arising from the engagement of those stakeholders. And if you've noticed, I'm using the typology that I published in the Research Impact Handbook, which I've discussed in the first episode of this season earlier this year. And I would argue that the inclusion of this is consistent with the classic definition of stakeholders from Freeman in 1984, which is those who are both affected by or who can affect change. Because what I'm doing now is I'm making explicit the potential for positive benefits or harm to arise from their interests and influence or lack thereof. It's also important to emphasise the need to regularly revisit the analysis to capture new stakeholders as they become relevant to the research and to ensure that engagement with research remains targeted to the dynamic needs of what are inevitably changing interests out there in our stakeholders and in our publics. So Brexit happens. All of a sudden, I've got a whole load of new issues that I'm dealing with. And how can I make sure this is now relevant in a post-Brexit world, for example? We have to keep just being aware of the kind of events and circumstances that might really change who is interested and why perhaps the same people are now interested for different reasons, have different levels of influence, and may be impacted in new ways. In my blog, now you can have a look if you want and see what this then comes up with. We've got a typology of different stakeholders based on this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different types. So I've got disinterested stakeholders. I've got those who are disinterested and impacted, whether positive or negatively. I've got those who are disinterested. This is disinterested and negatively impacted. I've got disinterested influencers. I've got disinterested, influential, and negatively impacted. I've got those who are only interested. I've got those who are interested and impacted. I've got those who are interested influencers. And I've got those who are interested, influential, and negatively impacted. No, you know what? I got that slightly wrong. Impacted is positive or negative. I got that right the first time around. You know what? What you need to do is go and have a look at the blog, and you can see this table. It gives you a sense now of how this works. But it's a very fine-grained typology, and as you can hear, work in progress because I'm getting my own typology wrong here. But try it out and see how it works. So to do this, you need to head along to the blog where I've got a link in the show notes. Download the PDF. To be honest, it's a bit of a big table. So what I recommend is print this out, copy and paste the headings, maybe into a Word file, blow them up now onto one heading per sheet of A4 paper. So you can have this big, and you're going to now want to transpose this onto flip chart paper. So what we're doing, you'll see an image at the top of the blog of what this might look like in practice, is we've got a table, but we've now blown this up onto an entire wall using flip chart paper. I've created the columns with my flip chart pens, and at the heading of each column, I've now printed out each of these different these different headings. And I'm just going to work through each of the headings that we've got here. Where are we? So I need to actually find this. Here we go. So the first column is the name of the organization, the group or the individual that we're analyzing. And then I've got 4 things I'm going to ask you in terms of interest. The first is the scope of their interest. So normally I think about this geographically. Is this a local stakeholder, national or international? But there are many other ways in which you might want to do this in terms of diversity or social groups or things like that. But the reason I'm doing this is that quite often you don't realise that we've got our blinkers on and we're here sitting in this town. That's our focus. But actually, there are a whole lot of people who maybe don't live here, but have very big interest in what happens here. And they have a more national or perhaps an international focus. And actually, they've got a huge amount of power over what actually can happen here. So we need to bring them in. So just making people aware of that right at the beginning. Next then, we've got the nature of their interest. So this is the interest category, and it's the top level, the more surface level. So my question is, what aspects of the research are they likely to be interested in, or why are they likely to not be interested? And we describe. Then we go to the second deeper level, which is the nature of the interest in terms of values. So what values and beliefs or assumptions might drive or inhibit this interest or disinterest? And then finally, the level of interest. Based on all of that, let's categorize this as high, medium, or low. And it's not just a kind of a finger in the air thing. Now, I've got a sense now of, what underpins that categorization as high, medium, or low. And now I can use this much later to really quickly run through all of the rows that I've got to identify who might be the hard to reach groups, where I've got low on interest, low on influence, high on impact, for example, and pull them out to prioritize first, for example. Next, let's move to influence, which is now our indirect mode of impact. And I've got, again, 4 questions here. So the first 2 are on the nature of the influence. So this is my ability, the ability of this organisation to facilitate or block the generation of benefits from the research. So can this organisation block impact? If so, why and how? Now let's have a think about the nature of that power at a deeper level. So let's have a think about first of all, the explicit hierarchical power over, or then let's look at the implicit personal or transpersonal power with. So we understand that they can block or facilitate, and these are the ways in which. But now I'm asking you much deeper. Tell me, what's the nature of this? Is it explicit, implicit? Power over, power with? Maybe it's a bit of both, but we're doing that deeper thinking now. And then I want to understand something about the reach of that influence. So it may be that I've got an organisation that has the ability to influence one person. But if that one person happens to be the president of the country, then, well, that's fairly far-reaching, and I need to know that. It may be that it may be a fairly low level, but actually this is now the largest membership organisation in Europe, and what they can do, even at a low level, is worth knowing about because of that reach. So whether it's a geographical scale, a social scale, or some other scale, tell me about that. And now, based on these 2 different ways of thinking about the nature of the influence and its depth, and the reach of that influence, I might categorize the level of that high, medium, or low. And then finally, impact, and this is the direct impact of your research or of their engagement with your research on them, now positive or negative. So first of all, I want to understand the nature of that impact. So is the research likely to generate direct benefit or negative impacts for this organisation? What are those benefits? What might be those negative impacts? And I want to know something about the timing of this now. Is this something that's going to happen in the short term or over the long term? And I want to know something about the level of that impact. How significant is this likely to be for that organisation? Again, high, medium, or low, based on what I've done before. And you'll notice that this is now marrying up with what I talk about in relation to impact all the time. These two criteria you might use to evaluate whether your impact is worthwhile. I want to know, is it significant? Does it resonate? Does anyone care about it? Does it really matter? And how far-reaching might this be, whether it's geographical, social, some other scale. So significance and reach are built into this, which means that I can then prioritise accordingly if I wish. I've then added one final column, which is just other context. So from experience doing this, every now and then there's just something else that's really important, really useful that I need to know about this organisation. So they are in conflict with that other organisation, and they have been for decades, and you cannot put them both in the same room or sparks will fly. Or this organisation suing that organisation, and you're going to have to take legal advice before you go and talk to them, perhaps. Those kinds of little bits of information might be like gold dust, in fact, and let's just make sure that we've given people the chance to tell us all of those things. So that is what it looks like. I've fine-grained this for you now. You're getting a much deeper sense of the kind of questions you can ask. And I hope you're already getting a sense now of just how useful and how deeply useful this is now going into an organisation, knowing that kind of stuff about them. So finally, let's just conclude with my workshop plan. So very briefly, I think it's really important to note that this is a social science research method. So I believe it is important that you get ethics approval for this through your ethics committee in your university, that you make sure that you get informed consent from the stakeholders you invite to take part in this analysis with you. Now, I know some people would say, well, it's just part of my pathway to impact, and most people don't go through those kind of things. But for me, this is a controversial technique, as I'll explain in a moment, and I think you want to protect yourself and the people there by making sure you've gone through all of these mechanisms. So get ethics approval, get a consent form, make sure you're discussing with the group exactly what the issues around this might be. And the key issue now is that we make people aware that we're going to talk confidentially about our personal opinions and perspectives on the relative interest, influence, and impact of each of these different organisations, and in some cases of individuals within and named individuals within those organisations. And some of your opinions may or may not be very flattering. And as a result, if this now gets into the public domain and into the hands of the person that we're saying has no power whatsoever, despite the fact that they're the head of their organisation, they may not be happy about this. And this is not something that I would ever want to be kind of published in case of libel or whatever else. This is an internal thing that we're using to discuss our own opinions, to share knowledge, to empower us to now be able to deal more effectively with these organisations to benefit them. So let's make this very clear to people. Now, I tend to invite anywhere between 3 and 5 stakeholders to something like this. I've done it with a couple. It can still work. And worst case scenario, you've just got one person, if they have the knowledge of all of the organisations and interest groups in that area, that's still better than you doing this by yourself. But ideally, you've got at least 3 people in the room, which means you can start to triangulate this. And no, I disagree with you. And I think actually for these reasons, you might think about this a bit differently. And you get that discussion going. You get much richer data. You can do this with much more people. You can do it with 10. I quite regularly do that. And for political reasons, you might want to do that. You might want to have your entire research team involved, as we did with Helen Kendall and colleagues in our obesity project. What I would recommend you don't do, however, is to invite all of your stakeholders to it. So I had a nightmare scenario once where I was doing a stakeholder analysis for government many years ago, and I had a very good civil servant. And so it got out that we were doing a stakeholder analysis, and one by one, various stakeholder organisations in this highly conflicted space contacted the government to say, we've heard you're doing a stakeholder analysis, can we get involved? And one by one, the civil servant said, said, oh, okay, yeah. And now they're involved. They tell their friends, and hey, why are we not invited? We want to be involved. And by the end of this, I had no idea. I'd asked them to invite 2 or 3, up to 5 maximum stakeholders. And I came and there were 30 people in the room. In fact, all the stakeholders that we were meant to be analysing, including a whole load of people that were very high power, low power. And now a very awkward conversation together, rating the relative interest and influence, and which was all I was doing at that stage, of everyone in the room. Yeah, it wasn't a comfortable workshop, let me tell you. We've got a few people, relevant people in the room. We've gone through ethics. We've got a consent form. So first part of my workshop is I'm doing introductions to everyone, explaining what the ethics procedure we're under, and the fact that they need to look at these consent forms. I work through them. I make sure that they understand them. This is informed consent after all. And I emphasise why it's so important this is confidential. So we're not taking photographs, and it's Chatham House rules, etc., etc. Second point is now I introduce the analysis, so I explain what stakeholder analysis is, my 3 questions, pretty easy to get your head around, and we have a bit of a discussion about the scope of the analysis. Are we going to draw a very clear line? If you're not in this community, you're out, or it's going to be a UK geographical one, or some other kind of social group where we're working with LGBT plus groups only, and therefore if you're not in that category, we're not going to consider you, for example. Who knows? And then I explain each of the headings. I'm now standing up and pointing through. And actually, the way that I do this is I do it with a worked example. So let's choose an organisation we all know something about. And now let's go through each of those columns in the same way that I've just done with you, but with a worked example. Once I've done that, you're going to need at least 20 minutes to do that first example, depending on how much conversation there is, how controversial that organisation is, perhaps half an hour. And now you're moving into the stakeholder analysis properly. So, right, you know how to do this. I want you all now to work individually. Take a pad of post-it notes and now just identify a stakeholder organisation or a group or an individual, put them in column A and start working across. I'm keeping an eye on what's going on in case there are 2 people working on the same organisation, in which case I try and get them to merge so we don't get duplicates. And we spend at least an hour. If you can encourage people with a break in the middle to do this for 2 hours, then that's quite useful. People always say, but there's too many, I can't do this all. And I just say, look, go with the organisations that come to mind first, that for whatever reason you think are probably most important. And that means then that we will draw a line after 1 hour or 2 hours, however long you can persuade people to work for. And we've got hopefully the most important ones. And then after the event, I'm sending this around and saying, right, now fill in the gaps with the other organisations in your own time. But we've got a big enough and diverse enough group that we can take this to the next step. The next step then is to do some checking. So I get everyone to participate. To check the work done by the other participants. So adding comments or post-it notes where, no, I would see this quite differently. I think actually they're massively powerful for these reasons. Or you just need to speak to that person. That's how you make things happen, or whatever it is. And we don't have to have the same opinions here. Yeah? Divergence is good. The fact that there are 2 different ways of looking at this organisation, 2 different groups within that organisation, 2 different perspectives, that's useful. I want to know that. And then I facilitate a discussion finally around any key points that the group think we need to discuss. And I tend to focus on areas where there is disagreement or confusion to try and resolve these through group discussion. Accepting that the resolution might be there are just 2 different views, and that's fine. But we have that discussion as a whole group at the end. There's one final step, and this is now something that is not my own technique. This is called stakeholder-derived stakeholder classification, if you look that up in Google Scholar. The way that this is done in the literature, you basically get all of your stakeholders and you put them on cards and you shuffle the cards, and now you get people to put the stakeholders into different piles. Now, in reality, that doesn't work in a workshop setting. So my adaptation of this is that I get the group to split into at least 2 subgroups. So I've got now, ideally, I've got now my minimum 3 people. So I've got 2 pairs working on this. But if I've got a dozen people, I might have 3 groups of 4 working on this at the same time in parallel. And I want each group to come up, if you can, with at least 2 different ways in which I might be able to categorize all of these different stakeholders that we've identified so far. Now, in reality, they may only come up with 1, but at least you've now got 2 to choose between because you've got at least 2 subgroups. And the point I'm trying to make with this is to get people to realize there is not just one way I can slice this pie. There are lots of different ways in which I could do this. So I could say we've got 2 categories, for and against this kind of new technology we're developing in our research, for example. Or I might have for and against, and then within my for and against, I've got public sector, private sector. I might have this based on some other functional classification. So I've got farmers, and then within farmers, I've got dairy farmers, arable farmers, hill farmers, for example. There's any number of different ways of doing this, and at the end, I want each group to say, well, I've got my classification. Let's check if it works. Go back to the tables and ask yourself, just randomly pick organizations and ask yourself, can this fit into one of my categories? And if you get a organization or group or individual that does not fit into any one of your categories, you've got a missing category. Your categorization doesn't quite work. What is that missing category? Can we add that in? Great. And then finally, I bring my groups together, and each group presents its preferred categorization, but also it presents, well, here's what we thought about first, and this is why we rejected that, and this is what we think is perhaps the best way of doing this. And in my experience, very often you actually get quite a lot of convergence at that point. And where you don't, then quite often you get that ability to layer. So we're going to have for and against, and then within for and against, we're going to have public versus private sector, because actually we can be public sector for, public sector against. We can be private sector for, private sector against. Great. And whether it's by that process of convergence, and no, this actually makes most sense, this is most functional, this is most useful, or some kind of compromise where we're combining those categorizations, you reach something now that everyone is happy with. And this classification step for me is really useful because now I've got my 5 core types or 6 key categories of stakeholders. And now, when I'm having a workshop, I'm going to make sure I've got at least one organization representing each of those different categories. Or I'm going to do some interviews now, and I'm going to make sure I've got at least 2 interviews per type. And now I've got a replicable method that I can use that I can now use to tell people why it is that that organization was invited and not them. Because we couldn't invite everyone, and we've made sure we've at least got one organization representing farmers, for example. And we went for the National Farmers Union. And yes, it would be really useful if I could have had the room around the table to invite the dairy rep and the arable rep. But we didn't. We've got NFU, so please bear with us here, and we'll engage you in some other way in the project, but that's why we've done this. The final stage of my workshop, as in any workshop, is an action planning step. So what happens next? Who's going to do what? We're going to write this up, and we're going to ask you to then fill in some of the gaps. We're going to get this to you by this date. And I'm emphasizing, again, this is anonymous. And whatever we put into the public domain will be, here are the stakeholder categories or types. Here perhaps are some examples of organizations within each type. And examples of some of the kind of things we've written in answer to these questions, but not linking them to specific organizations so that nobody gets offended. But you still get a flavor, a sense of actually what's going on within each of these different categories of stakeholders. So it's going to remain anonymized in terms of anything we publish. And in the meantime, we need to be super careful about what we're doing with our emails and electronic versions of this that are flying around and whose hands they get into, so that this works for us. At the end of the guide, you'll see an equipment list as well. And I put in some further reading, 1, 2, 3, about 7 or 8 different papers that I've written with my team, my colleagues and I, on stakeholder analysis that is the theory behind this new technique that explains this more deeply. So, Stakeholder analysis, the 3 I's framework. This is not for the faint-hearted. This is when you really need to understand your stakeholders, your publics, to a depth that you're unable to get in any other way. Use this technique, and I promise you, you will understand the people who are coming into your workshops, the people that you're now engaging with out there, to a much deeper level than ever before. And for me, the depth of that knowledge is what is the power you now have to be able to engage intelligently, to engage empathically, so that you now do research with people, not just for, certainly not on people, that genuinely resonates, that meets need, that brings people with us and enables us to co-produce our pathways to impact.